This is episode 241 of Stand Up. Joining me on the program today, Dr. Christina Greer, political scientist at Fordham University, author and policy expert Matt Yglesias, formerly of Vox, to talk about his new book, 1 Billion Americans. My name is Pete Dominic. It's time to stand up with me right now. Hello, my friends, and welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me here today. I've got a few things, as always, to say up front, a few clips to play for you, and then we will get to both of my excellent guests on today's program. Lots of great feedback on Barry Ritholtz, who joined me yesterday, Dr. Neil Buddy Shaw, my conversation about GiveWell.org. Thank you very much. Keep the emails coming. Always love to hear from you. Stand up with Pete at gmail.com. Chris P. wrote to me about the clutter struggle. He said he was listening to yesterday's episode 240 with Barry Ritholtz. I mentioned my clutter struggle. He said, and I wanted to read this for everybody because it cleansed me. It always makes me feel good to know I'm not alone. He said, I want you to know this is something I suffer from daily. I have 2 children, 5 and 7, been working from home since March. My wife and I have cleaned our basement 3 times over and managed to eliminate quite a bunch of stuff, but it still doesn't feel like enough. Gives me huge anxiety. Your show kicks ass. You're opening up yourself and encouraging guys like myself that we're not alone. Cheers, Chris. Thank you, Chris, for admitting that. Yeah, same thing happens to my garage. I clean it up. Everything is clean. It's dusted, literally. I vacuum everything. And like 3 days later, it is filled with garbage and crap. And the question, of course, is where does it all come from? In my case, I keep having water get in places and having to tear out drywall and flooring and carpeting. It's always a lot of fun. Okay, so speaking of a lot of fun, last night on the Discord platform, which you can be a member of and join the conversation, thus proof that you're never alone. If you sign up to be a member of the Stand Up community, you get access to the Discord platform. A bunch of us were chatting last night, and I just want to say, I love you guys. I love this community. Everybody is just in there supporting each other, making each other laugh, and talking about our feelings and on things. And we're mostly complete strangers, and yet there's this kind of trust and credibility and affordability that people give to each other. And I just want to say thank you for everybody who was in that chat last night. We talked about several different issues. Many of them really important and consequential, and then some that are less consequential. When Martha said in the chat, complaining as we were about how our glasses get steamed up from wearing masks, she said, does rubbing soap on your glasses work or not? Somebody do it and tell me if it works. It's like, Martha, you have to do it. It was your idea. You ruined your glasses. Anyway, we have conversations like that and more important and more serious conversations as well about familial issues and you name it. COVID, obviously, politics, and it's just a great group of people. So sign up to be a part of that. And I don't know how to describe it any better than I am right now. It just provides me so much comfort knowing that there's always a group of people willing to chat, and you get lonely, especially now. And as we talked about yesterday with Barry Ritholtz, we're only at the halfway point, maybe, and before we really can kind of very much get back to, quote, normal, if ever. And so I think it's important to build communities and have access to people like this that aren't always your close personal friends and family who you know or people, colleagues at work, but just a bunch of people that you met online. And I hope to see you guys tonight at 8 p.m. We're hanging out 8 Eastern in the Hangout. If you are a stand-up subscriber, you have automatic access to that as well so that you're never alone. Okay, so let's see. Where do I want to start? I want to start with a really important development, an issue that's interesting to follow. And I think the runoff election in Georgia for the United States Senate is so important. And what is happening right now is absolutely bizarre because Donald Trump is still every day contesting the outcome of the election, which his own people say there was no fraud in. And by his own people, I mean all the experts in all the states, the secretaries of state, the people who ran the election for the federal government, Department of Homeland Security. Everybody involved in the election says there's no fraud. His own attorney general said no significant fraud. It's only his lawyers, who are making such claims, as well as right-wing media, people trying to take your money and your soul. But he is saying specifically that Georgia, the election in Georgia, was fraudulent, as well as others as well. But the issue that brings up, that I'm sure you've already heard about and have been thinking about, is why then would people who believe that the election in Georgia was fraudulent, why would they then go vote in the runoff election January 5th? It's wild what's happening. This is the most important election, this Senate election. This election will determine the control of the Senate. And if Democrats gain control of the Senate, and they have the House, and obviously have the White House, I think you know what that means. Things can get done. Change can happen. Progress can be made. I mean, if that's how you see progress. But they're actually literally telling Republicans not to vote in the runoff election. Trump's lawyers are telling Georgia Republicans don't vote in the Senate runoff. Yesterday, pro-Trump attorney Lin Wood urged Georgia Republicans at a rally to sit out the state's upcoming Senate runoff elections, arguing that the two Republicans in the running first needed to back demands for a special legislative session to investigate Donald Trump's defeat in the state. And I'm about to play you this guy, Lin Wood, saying just that. He's an absolute maniac. But let me just real quick tell you about him, because everybody's been playing these clips all day. I saw them on TV. I saw them online. And if you're like me, you're wondering, who are the lawyers who would represent Donald Trump, period, much less in this scam that he's running right now to overturn an election? And this guy, Lin Wood, obviously Rudy Giuliani, you've heard of this woman, Sidney Powell, this other woman, Jenna Ellis. But this guy, Lin Wood, is a really interesting character with a wild history. When he was 16 years old, he came home and found his father had beaten his mother to death. His dad pleaded guilty and served 2 years. But this guy went on to become a lawyer, I guess, as a result of that somehow. First, he represented Richard Jewell, which is fine. That was a security guard falsely accused of Centennial Olympic Park bombings. Anybody seen that movie, by the way, about him? Is it good? But then he went on to become kind of a celebrity lawyer. He's also a personal injury lawyer, a medical malpractice lawyer where he made millions. But he represented John and Patsy Ramsey, the parents of John Bonet, in their defamation suit. He then went on to represent former U.S. Congressman Gary Condit. The alleged victim in the Kobe Bryant case. He represented her. In 2011, he represented Herman Cain in his efforts to fight off sexual harassment accusations. He was also the lead attorney in Nicholas Sandmann's defamation suit against the Washington Post, the Covington Catholic high school kid. In 2020, he represented Dr. Simone Gold, who was fired for appearing in videos making false claims about COVID-19. He also volunteered to work on the defense team of Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old kid who was charged with homicide for shootings in Kenosha this summer. And now, of course, he's out there defending Donald Trump. That's who Lin Wood is. And here is what he had to say about the Georgia runoff elections and the two Republicans that are running.
Where's Kelly Loeffler here? Where's David Perdue? He ought to be standing right here. Those two people want your vote, then they ought to tell you what we're telling Brian Kemp. Get a special session of the legislature now.
For what? To do what?
Do not be fooled twice. This is Georgia. We ain't dumb.
Yeah, you are. You are.
We're not going to go vote on January 5th in another machine made by China.
You're telling people not to vote.
You're not going to fool Georgians again. If Kelly Loeffler wants your vote, if David Perdue wants your vote, they've got to earn it. They've got to demand publicly, repeatedly, consistently, Brian Kemp call a special session of the Georgia legislature.
For what?
And if they do not do it, if Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue do not do it, they have not earned your vote.
Wow.
Don't you give it to them.
Yeah, keep it going, Lin Wood. Thank you. Whose side are you on? I'll tell you whose side he's on. Lin Wood's side. Donald Trump's on Donald Trump's side. Rudy Giuliani's on Rudy Giuliani's side. They could care less about anybody else. It's their profile. It's their career. It's the money. It's the power. They really genuinely don't care. They don't care about the Senate, control of the Senate. They could care less about it. They're telling people not to vote. Here's a little bit more from this rally that took place in Georgia yesterday with this whack job.
I've looked at the real numbers. He won over 410 electoral votes.
Electrical vote. We all must
He
be.
damn near won every state, including California.
What? No, I don't think.
80+ million votes.
No. Nope.
We're not going to let them steal our election. We're not going to let them steal our country. And we will die before we'll ever let them steal our freedom.
Oh, that doesn't sound good. We will die before we let them steal our freedom. Take it down a notch there, Braveheart Linwood. Guy's an absolute nightmare, but at the same time, maybe he's a gift. I mean, what is the motivation going to be for Republican voters if they are told not to waste their time, that it's all rigged, that this is just a crazy, crazy development, and it's led by crazy, insane people who don't care about their client or anything other than themselves. And we all know those types of celebrity lawyers. We've been seeing them for years. And Donald Trump has been rolling with those folks his entire life because he is one of them, reptilian. And speaking of Trump, yesterday he held a 45-minute, he made a video and posted it to Facebook. The networks weren't going to carry it. He knew they weren't going to carry it because he was saying crazy things. And this speech or video that he made, it was called Rambling, Bizarre, Sad, Pathetic. And I just want to play 20 seconds of it because I just want you to understand his logic and what he's saying, because maybe you have friends or family member, or maybe even you listening might believe this. But I thought this was really an important part, an interesting part, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories. But this one to me isn't a conspiracy. This one makes perfect sense. And Donald Trump basically explains the process of how returns come in, and there's no questions here about any kind of fraudulent activity. This is just how it works. Listen to him explain it. Listen to this whiny little baby.
We're leading by a lot. And then at 3:42 in the morning, there was this. It was a massive dump of votes.
It's because a lot of people voted in there.
Mostly Biden. This is Michigan.
Yeah, it's Detroit.
At 6:31 in the morning, a vote dump. That batch was received in horror. Here's what is normal.
Horror.
And all of a sudden, look at that. This is normal. Normal. Look, even here. Normal. And then boom, all of a sudden. Everyone is saying, wow. No. The evidence is overwhelming when they get to see it.
No, the evidence is that a lot of people live in Milwaukee and Detroit, and they mostly don't like you, so they voted for Joe Biden, and that's what time those votes came in. It's weird how he's explaining that, and I don't know. I don't know how people are confused about how that works. We should make it better and more efficient, and let people vote early and easily, and then count them before election night. That's what a number of states do, including Florida. So we could do that. All right. So it's the first week of December. The president and his lawyers and his supporters in right-wing media, as well as the United States Senate and Congress, are still questioning the outcome of the election, which there is no question about. There just isn't. But they won't let it stop them, and it's important to pay attention to that. And, of course, the Georgia runoff. But I really hope that they keep telling Georgia Republicans not to vote. I thought I read that the president was going to go down there for a rally. Is that still on? We'll see what he says. All right, lastly, let's look at the last president, President Obama, who gave an interview to my old friend Peter Hamby. Used to work with Peter at CNN. He is over at Snapchat now, and President Obama was on Peter's show, Good Luck America, that aired Wednesday, and was asked about Obama thought about the defund the police slogan and how that affected the election.
I guess you can use a snappy slogan like defund the police, but you know you've lost a big audience the minute you say it, which makes it a lot less likely that you're actually going to get the changes you want done. But if you instead say, let's reform the police department so that everybody's being treated fairly, divert young people from getting into crime. And if there's a homeless guy, maybe we send a mental health worker there instead of an armed unit that could end up resulting in a tragedy. Suddenly, a whole bunch of folks who might not otherwise listen to you are listening to you. So the key is deciding, do you want to actually get something done, or do you want to feel good among the people you already agree with?
Now, I thought that was fairly reasonable and nuanced, as he often is. But a lot of progressive Democrats, including my guest, Dr. Christina Greer, were critical of that. And a lot of black folks, specifically Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, tweeted, "We lose people in the hands of police. It's not a slogan, but a policy demand. And centering the demand for equitable investments and budgets for communities across the country gets us progress and safety." In response to that, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, "The murders of generations of unarmed black folks by police have been horrific. Lives are at stake daily, so I'm out of patience with critiques of the language of activists. Whatever a grieving family says is their truth, and I'll never stop fighting for their justice and healing." New Congresswoman Cori Bush, all of these women are black women. She writes on Twitter in reference to Obama's remarks there, "With all due respect, Mr. President, let's talk about losing people. We lost Michael Brown Jr. We lost Breonna Taylor. We're losing our loved ones to police violence. It's not a slogan. It's a mandate for keeping our people alive. Defund the police." So I don't know where you're going to come down with the president or with his critics or with Dr. Christina Greer. I asked her about it at the end of our conversation coming up. Before I get to that, I now wanted, these are the headlines. These are some audio clips I wanted to play for you in case you hadn't heard them, give you some context on the day's news. And now I want to give you maybe the less covered stories, the stories on the second page of the newspaper, most of which are important and impactful. Some are just entertaining. And that's what I try to do around 17 minutes in this first segment. It's about 20 minutes, but now time for the news dump.
They call them dumps, big, massive dumps.
All right, here we go. The CDC has shortened its COVID-19 quarantine recommendations from the standard 14-day quarantine. Now they're saying that potential exposure warrants a quarantine of 10 or 7 days, depending on one's test results and symptoms. More COVID-related headlines. The mayor of Austin, Texas, apparently told everybody not to go anywhere, stay home. But then apparently he went to a wedding in Cabo in Mexico. And that's gotten him in a lot of trouble, my friends in Austin, Isaac and Cornell. An owner of New York City bar was providing indoor service in defiance of coronavirus restrictions, was arrested after a sting in which plainclothes officers went inside and ordered food and beverages because the guy defied coronavirus restrictions, the bar owner, and then he got arrested by New York cops. Huh? How about that? A couple, speaking of getting arrested for COVID, was arrested for boarding a San Francisco flight to Hawaii after they tested positive for COVID-19. Hawaii couple traveled from San Francisco airport to Hawaii had been arrested for boarding the flight when they knew they were positive for COVID-19. Big win for cannabis. The United Nations Commission has removed cannabis from its most strict drug control list. Yay! Very exciting. All right. The UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs voted to reclassify cannabis on Wednesday, taking it off the strict Schedule 4 list that includes dangerous and highly addictive drugs such as heroin. Emotional support animals are no longer guaranteed on flights for free. Department of Transportation said Wednesday will no longer require airlines to make the same accommodations for emotional support animals as they do for trained service dogs. So no more guaranteed free flights for comfort cats and dogs, therapy monkeys, or miniature horse companions, according to NPR. And the Secret Service apparently investigated comedian John Mulaney after an SNL joke, which is pretty bizarre. And finally, 2 feet of snow fell in Northeast Ohio, 90,000 customers without power, wind chill warnings in Florida. It's getting cold. Winter is here, and that is your news dump. Look at that. the show is really coming together. There's segments now. You got the opening, you got the news dump, and the interview segment, kind of 3 separate segments. Most shows have been averaging like an hour and a half, but some are more, some are less, and I don't know. I keep developing it. Maybe I'll make it a 1-hour show every day. I am excited about experimenting with video. Anyway, let me get to my first guest, because this whole show is always supposed to be about learning and coming together and supporting each other and becoming better people, evolving all the time. That's always what it's been about, teaching critical theory, thinking and hearing other points of views that aren't necessarily your own. And right now, I've got a great guest who I always love talking to. She is a political scientist at Fordham University. She's got her PhD. So she's a doctor, of course, associate professor of political science. She's also an author. She's working on a new book. She was moderating a conversation last night with Senator Elizabeth Warren and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who I mentioned earlier. She's constantly doing all kinds of really great things. She's also, like me, a nature lover. We talked a little bit about that. We always talk about everything. I love talking with my friend Chrissy Greer, and I think you're going to really enjoy today's conversation. Hit her up, give her a follow on Twitter at @DR_CM Greer. Started by talking about code switching and having different identities, and that is where our conversation picks up.
Yeah, I mean, I think people have multiple identities and they shift, right?
That's
so when
okay,
I teach,
right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're multifaceted people.
Yep.
So, I mean, when I teach race politics or like my race and ethnic politics class, I'll have people write down all of their identity. Just like, I'll give you 10 minutes, write them all down. Some people will come up with like 50 different identities. It's like, I'm Catholic or I'm atheist, right? I'm a woman or I'm non-binary. Like some people are like, I'm short, right? Like that's, for some people, that's an identity.
Yeah.
Right. Or I'm overweight. Like that's an identity. Or I have green eyes, which isn't common, so like all these different identities, or I could say I'm Black American, but I'm like low key Caribbean, so like you list them, but then sometimes, I'm sorry, sirens in New York City. Then I ask them to rank them, which is really hard because, I view myself as, say, a Black woman. And I view myself, I think, Black before female. But depending on the situation, if I walked into a room with 1,000 men, my primary identity in that moment would most likely feel like, oh, I'm a woman, right? Or if I was in a room with nothing but Korean people, I might feel very Black American at the time. So this idea that we sort of code switch and adapt depending on our circumstance, it's like I curse like a sailor, not in the classroom, not on podcasts, not in front of the elderly. But when I'm with my friends, when I'm not on air, like I've got a bit of a potty mouth, right? So I think that's normal for a lot of people.
It's normal and it's acceptable, and it's super interesting to think about what your different identities might be. And I also can't stop thinking about you just hanging out with a ton of Korean people, just you and a ton of Korean people. I don't know where this happens.
I love Korean food, so I'm like putting Seoul is on my bucket list. So when my grandparents died in 2007, they were married 68 years. They died within a week of one another.
What?
So, pretty dramatic. So my aunt died. That was totally unrelated. She'd been ill. Then my grandmother, then my grandfather, all within 12 days total. So my mom's family was just essentially wiped out in like less than 2 weeks. But when I got back to Massachusetts, I was on a fellowship in Northampton. I just needed like comfort food, And so a friend of mine and I used to always go see like a Black movie. They would show like one Black movie at the movie theater, and we'd go for soul food before the movie. So we would go to the one Korean spot.
But you said it twice now, and it can be confusing. Soul food, SEOUL.
SEOUL. So we would go for soul food. So we'd eat Korean food and then go see a Black movie.
That's a pretty probably original tradition.
Yeah. Well, soul food is, because it's like it's comfort
I don't know
food.
What is it? What's an example?
My favorite is bibimbap and hot stone pot. So it's like a piping hot pot with rice. I'm a rice connoisseur.
That's now my favorite just because of how it sounds when you say it.
Right. Listen, they've got bulgogi, like a type of beef that you cut with scissors.
Do they have gorgu?
Grogu? I don't know what that is.
It's too bad that joke was lost on you. It's a Mandalorian reference. It's we thought Baby Yoda's name.
I've not seen that.
Moving on. So they don't have any Grogu.
I'm not Jason.
There goes
I don't care about the Star Wars references.
All right. I don't even have many. I really lost everybody. So I wanted to talk with you about, I have a few things listed, but first of all, I wanted to ask you like a huge question about how do we look back? I've been asking a lot of really smart people, political scientists like you, this kind of question. How do we begin to look back at the damage of the last 4 to 5 years? The Trump administration, Trumpism, the movement, the damage to our institutions, relationships, the climate, the environment, all of it. How do we talk about it? How do we look at it? We'll be doing it for years. Let's be clear.
Yeah, I think we'll be doing it for at least a generation, easily. I mean, honestly, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around it until after January 20th, when Joe Biden is like properly sworn in at 12 noon. And then it's going to be
good point. It's not over. Good point.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, we still have close, a little under 50 days. And so it's one of those things where, Winston Churchill says, like, if you're going through hell, keep going. And so for me, we're not out of it yet. So January 20th at say 2 p.m., there's going to be that collective, but it's sort of like after you've gotten out of a car accident, it's not until you sort of get home and you're like, what the hell just happened? And then it sort of hits you, sometimes that day, sometimes weeks later, where it's just like, I just went through something super traumatic. And I think it's going to hit different people in waves because it'll affect them in different ways.
Yeah. And it affects, different populations, different issues in different ways. And we don't even know how much of an effect, I guess, on things like foreign relations or, like I said, the environment or just. I'm
a birder. And so, like the policies that he's had sort of to take away protections from the birds and their environments, that's crazy. But also think about this.
He's protected them from the windmills.
Oh, the windmills. This man, I've just never seen someone who's so gleefully ignorant. But think about it this way. We have over 250,000 Americans who have died because of coronavirus. Like something that could have been definitely curtailed substantially. So that's not 200. That's not just like 260,000 people where I think that's where we are right now. But that's like 260,000 families. It's 260,000 communities. Yeah. We're seeing all these numbers of like teachers. So it's like 200 more. More than 260,000 like types of student populations who, had a favorite teacher who's died. And so, which is always traumatic for kids when they lose a teacher.
Sure.
So it's going to be, people who weren't allowed to have funerals, weren't allowed to come together as a family to grieve. I'm still grieving David Dinkins. We can't have a city funeral to honor the first and only Black mayor of New York City who did so much for so many people domestically and internationally. So when we can finally have those things, that grieving process is going to be pretty traumatic because we'll be grieving like not just the loss, but like the inability to grieve in that moment.
I feel like, it's all really good points. And I think that when we look back, we will look at the pandemic. We will look at Corona and we will look at what he, that he wasn't living in reality and that he didn't do anything and then he denied things. But I think I can't stop thinking about his reaction. I forget who it was. Maybe it was Jonathan Swan, whoever was interviewing him, talked about the thousands of Americans dead. And his answer was, it is what it is. And I feel like that is something that should be carved into stone because any mayor, any leader, anybody would say, listen, there's a boilerplate response to that. Right. Even if you don't care, there's a but he really doesn't care about other people. And no, I think not only gender and race, and he just doesn't care about anybody. And nowhere was that illustrated more in that one moment. It is what it is. Yeah. And think about
it this way. This is why Joe Biden's the president-elect. Like, he's a decent man. I think a lot of people, my dad said something. He's like, he's more decent than smart, but like, we need decent, like.
We do, because you can surround yourself with smart people. That's the point I'm getting at. Being
decent people surround themselves with smart people. I think he'll surround himself with people who actually care about this country, who won't be put in agencies just to destroy them. But like, Joe Biden understands loss. like in a visceral way that no parent should ever understand loss. He's lost 2 children, say nothing of his wife. He's lost 2 children, like one as a child and one as an adult. Like that is just, we don't have a word in the English language for it. But when I mean, for when that happens. Yeah. And so when he talks about like sitting around the table around the holidays and like seeing that empty space, or like seeing the stocking that used to belong to someone you love, like he gets it. He's not just like, shooting the breeze. Whereas like Donald Trump is like, so I always used to say he was filled with like, old VCR tapes and shredded newspaper. Like there's nothing inside of that man. Like
you're giving him too much credit. No, he's completely hollow.
He's just, and he's so angry.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like I had one day, I will say this. I had one day, maybe like 2 years ago, where I like sat and meditated. And when I sort of came to, I was like, I'm going to say a prayer for Donald Trump. I should write about this actually. And it was like so hard for me to do. But what came out of that experience, it was like, this man is so sad. He's like a pathetic person. But it's like, when I'm being very, 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 very generous and compassionate, it's like, what must have happened to you consistently throughout your childhood and your life for you to have this worldview where you're incapable of caring or sharing? It's like, it's not like not having a pet means you're cruel, but it's like, you can tell he doesn't appreciate nature. And like people who appreciate nature are a different type of person. I think it's hilarious. It's like cruel and as he is, but like, we're sort of curmudgeons and, we talk about politics and we make fun of folks on air and blah, blah, blah. But like both of us are really into nature. And that sort of is a salve, SALVE, for some of the harshness of the world. You can tell he would never sit there and like look at a sunset and be like, wow, isn't that a marvel? You would say, I wonder how much I could make off of, capitalizing that and like filming it. And then I could sell it to some suckers who'll go to a rally and, infect themselves with a disease.
At this point in our conversation, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable because I realize something. I want to tell you something, which is you and I, people don't know this, have been exchanging photos, videos, and even audio of nature for a few months now. And your photos, it started with you, just random like beach photos. When I got them, they would affect me in just the way I wanted to. And I've been cheating on you because I spread that idea and I said on the podcast, please send me your nature photos. I didn't say I've been doing this with my friend Chrissy. And so now people have been texting me and emailing me and tweeting me nature photos. And it's glorious, but I wanted to tell you.
Well. You learn something new every day, huh? Don't you? Well, I mean, here's the thing. There's enough beauty to go around. And I just think that, like, I love that about our friendship because sometimes, when I went on this walk in Philly and I sent you the pictures.
You have such a great eye. You have such a great eye. Yeah.
I don't think so. But, like, the more you do it, obviously, the better you get. But it was one of those things where I was just walking with my family and my sister was like, come on. We were walking to this store that was kind of far away and, the sun's going to come down in any minute now because it's wintertime. And I was just stopping along the way and taking these pictures. But then afterwards, I was like, I'm so glad I stopped because there are times where it's like, I don't take pictures. I just need to see it with my mind's eye and like interpret it in my heart. And like, that's it. And like, it's fleeting and like only I see it and that's that. But there were certain leaves where I was like, no, these colors mean something. And like, I looked through my phone from the pandemic and it's like, well, what's been going on in the pandemic? And my phone is nothing but like joy and like happiness.
The pictures.
The pictures on my phone.
It's such I just wanted just to add one thing to that, which is I try not to mix digital with nature, but I find myself photographing and even taking videos of a lot of things because I'll say I'm at this place, I'm at this lake, and I'll be like, you know what? I wish Chrissy could see this. I wish someone could see this. I'm going to take a photo and send it to her. And it's kind of, that's the implication. I wish you could see this. I'm going to take a moment out of this moment for me and share it with you. And wherever, and maybe you're cooped up right now, by the way, and then you see this amazing sunset. That's what your photos do to me. That's what the photos do to me. And I mean, you sent me a picture of a tree the other day that had such character that it made me stop for like at least a minute and think about that tree's life and how people walk past it and see it, and getting back on track.
Well, I'm a tree hugger. Like, I will sit there and hug a tree for like 10 minutes.
I'll say it out loud. I will hump a tree. I'm a tree humper. I'm a tree humper.
But I am going to go into quarantine for, in 2 weeks, I've got to go into quarantine for 10 days because I want to see my family for Christmas. So send all the pictures because I will be here by myself.
That time frame is.
Thinking that I'm not going insane, but
we'll inundate you with it. Getting back to the Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is the kind of guy, and I'm sure there are other people like this too, that are developers that sees a beautiful lake and thinks, let's take all these trees down and build apartments and hotels all around it. That's a lot of people, and that's a problem. We have to understand and appreciate the history of conservation, the role of conservation, and the government is the primary actor on conservation. And so I think a lot of damage will be done there. But let me ask you, so the answer to the question is, how much damage has been done? It's twofold. He's not done, and it's going to take us a long time.
I mean, Bill Barr's talking about firing squads. Pompeo's still going overseas doing God knows what with God knows whom, right? They're still going to try and rip apart Native American lands and, environmental treaties on the way out, right? So it's like, it's a huge deal that Joe Biden's the president-elect. There's still far too many Republican senators who are like, well, if he's, sworn in, it's like, no, he will be sworn in. We are certifying these electors. Like December 14th is going to happen. So I think it's dangerous on their part.
That's the date. December 14th is the date that the U.S. Congress confirms the election. Is that what?
That people go to their state, the electors go to their state houses and cast their ballots. Through the Electoral College.
Which is different than the states certifying the election.
The states will certify their elections on December 14th. And that's when the electors, so if Joe Biden won Georgia, right? The Democratic electors in Georgia will go to the state house and cast their ballots for Joe Biden. That means Joe Biden will then get the 16 Electoral College votes.
Arguably the most damage the president has done is what he has been doing every day, long before the election and every day since the election. He also did this, of course, in 2016, is he is destroying America's belief in our elections, in our own democracy. Today, I read some tweets of his that he's going to win. He still has a lot of support and important people support him in both media and in Congress. That will be probably the worst damage, arguably, during the lame duck session that he does if he doesn't succeed in starting a war with Iran or something. The constant drumbeat of him saying, I won, it's fixed. What is that? How do you can you wrap your head around that?
Yeah, I mean, I've always said the biggest danger has also been to convince the American public that the media is just not to be trusted, right? And in many ways, we know we have three branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial. I put it in that order in particular because that's the order it is in the Constitution. Legislative is first, not executive, even though there's supposed to be three equilateral branches of government, checks and balances, separation of powers, Federalist 51. The fact that the framers put the legislative branch first gives us a little bit of an Easter egg that maybe they thought that the legislative branch might have a touch more power. Maybe. We'll see. But the fourth branch of government that we oftentimes talk about in Introduction to Politics is the media. They're that silent branch of government. And so the first destruction that Donald Trump did was to say, well, the media they're not truthful, they're not factual, they hate me. Here are all the things why, and here are the reasons why. And it's worked, right? Because now truth doesn't mean truth. We have people who will get on the media and say absolutely ridiculous things. And sadly, though, we have far too many people who work in the media who fundamentally don't understand race or racism. So they have let Donald Trump and his ilk come on the air and say egregiously racist things that only an older white man would be able to get away with. And then just sort of say like, okay, well, maybe, so they've sort of played along with this both sidesism that no one else gets the luxury to have, except for a wealthy white man. And so this like go along to get along because we don't want to upset him has gotten us to this point where we have an autocratic president. We have him essentially contributing to this hyper partisan judiciary. Essentially, that's why he kept saying, I'll take it to the Supreme Court. He's like, well, I put you three in power for this moment to do your jobs. What he didn't realize, if he had read a book once in his life, is that you can't just wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to the Supreme Court. You actually have to work your way up. And the frivolous lawsuits that he's bringing, no decent judge is actually going to touch it. And many people who are humoring him are not willing to do so after they've sworn on a Bible not to perjure themselves. So they're like, hey, we're not going to take this joke too far because I'm not going to prison for you. So because we've seen that he has no loyalty to anybody, just as Jeff Sessions, where is he? Unemployed, right?
Well, as Brian Kemp most recently.
I mean, Brian Kemp, who stole the election from Stacey Abrams, is all of a sudden now in cahoots with Stacey Abrams. I mean, like, listen to what you're saying, Donald. It's bananas. And Brian Kemp's like, listen, I already pulled the hustle on me. I did it in 2018 to help me win. I can't run the same play. Like, they know the play, dude. Like, and I keep counting it for you. And he literally said, I voted for you. My whole family voted for you. If I could move mountains to make this happen, I would, but I can't. Like, I just short of stealing, like I did last time, I can't do it again.
Let me try to tie it all together. And at some point, I'd love to just do like an hour with you just on your kind of analysis and criticism of media in general. But to tie it together, I mean, I often have this thought. I wrote something about it, and I write very little years ago, but that if you're in the media, there is no responsibility for anybody with a radio or television show to be truthful or honest. That there is none. There are no laws. No. There are no expectations anymore. Right-wing media specifically has been doing this for years, long before Trump, and it's fascinating to watch if it weren't so dangerous. But what they do on Hannity or Mark Levin especially is they demand that Republicans do this. What are they doing? These rhinos and so on. These are.
And I think the articles are brilliant of white people who've said, like, I've lost my parents to Fox News, right? Parents who raised them to be, thoughtful and engaging, and they have friends of color and the media gay friends, and like their parents are now the antithesis of that.
Well, these right wing guys, especially, I mean, I think it's almost exclusively on the right. Maybe it probably happens on the left too. But my point is, on the radio, they demand that Republicans in Congress pass a law. Stop a law, do a thing. Then they get the Republican, and I'll never forget Mark Levin interviewing dumb Ron Johnson, senator of Wisconsin, on the radio. And he says, why don't you do this? And Ron Johnson says, we don't have the votes. There's nothing we can do. I'm a senator because I love your show. I agree with you completely. What would you have me do? Same thing right now, though. All the right-wing media are demanding that Republicans do something, that they overturn the results. And Republicans in power, secretaries of state, governors, and are saying, there's no lever to pull or button to press. There is no fraud. We don't have a case. We can't make a case. You can say whatever you want on the radio. We can't do what we wish.
Right.
What you're demanding that we do.
Unless you want to make a time machine and go back in time and have the president actually handle the coronavirus and not be polarizing and incompetent and win the election fair and square. You didn't do that. So like, we can keep counting. And so I think, Donald Trump, for those of us who are from New York, we know he's so used to cheating. He's so used to lying. He's so used to stealing. That's how he's gotten everything that he's wanted. So this is sort of like, well, why can't you just make it happen? And folks are like, this isn't bribing the, New Jersey Water Board over here, like, or some sort of conservation agency or, some sort of town council. Like, we cannot create votes for you out of thin air. And Joe Biden has beaten you by so many thousands of votes. We can't just like throw out now that we've already counted them and they're all on the docket. So now we just have to come up with wild conspiracy theories that they're trucks of ballots that have been driven in that are for Joe Biden, or trucks of ballots for Donald Trump that were driven out and destroyed in a lake somewhere. Right. And it's hearsay. I mean, these are some arguments that, my 9-year-old niece is like, what in the world is he talking about? Like, it sounds like a whopper because it's a whopper. Yeah. And it's a desperate man trying to do desperate things. But there's so many grown men who need to say, listen, this is American democracy we're talking about. Yeah. Sit down. Like, yes, you've suffered an international embarrassment. You've suffered an embarrassment, because all of his other embarrassments, he could just frame it. It's like, I didn't want that building anyway.
Right.
And plus, you guys are suckers because I left you holding the bill for $200 million. Ha! So like, he's always been able to frame
Same
his
thing with
failures.
women.
He's had several. Like, he's had many, many failures over his life.
Yep.
But this one is very public. Mm-hmm. It's very black and white. It's very, definitive. You have lost. This is the second time now you've lost the popular vote. You said before, 306 electoral college votes. That's a mandate. Hillary Clinton, you need to sit down. Like, I got so much over 270. Look at my numbers. And now Joe Biden has 306. And it's like, that's cheating. There's no way he could get that. It's like, there's every possible way he could get that. We're in a recession. Folks are in breadlines. They're looking at their parents die and their children die, and they shouldn't have been in that situation. You said it is what it is. Some people are tired of waking up in the middle of the night, checking their phones to see if you're going to get us into a war in Iran. Like, some folks just want to go back to normal. There are obviously 71 million people who are like, sign me up for more of this. But there were 78 million people who were like, I'm exhausted by this.
Yeah.
I'm exhausted by it. And young people are exhausted by it.
Why do you say that? I mean, you would know because you teach young people, but
because they showed up in numbers that, were pretty, the young vote for Donald Trump, wasn't 100% by any stretch. I mean, he does have a hold on some young folks. But by and large, young people, were more into, I don't know if they were voting for Biden or just against Trump, but either way, they did not vote for him in droves.
I'm torn on this next question. I want to know what your take is on it. I would love for media to stop talking about Donald Trump and to stop.
Yeah, I don't know if they will.
Paying attention. And it's easy to say. I think the easy answer is stop paying attention to him. I think the more complicated, though, answer is this man is the head of a cult in our country that has 70 million people or more that follow it. We actually need to pay attention to what bin Laden says. Right. We need to pay attention to what Hitler says. Not if they have 10 followers. We can't pay attention to every crank. But if you are influencing the thinking of millions and millions of our family members and countrymen in our community, it's important to some extent to pay attention to what they say. Now, he's just said that he's going to, apparently the story today is he's going to announce his reelection. He's skipping the inauguration, and that's the day he's going to make a big press conference announcement of his reelection. And they say the network should not be paying attention. Fine. They shouldn't have any cameras on it. But, Mike, it's easy to say stop paying attention to him, Chrissy, but it's harder. Right. I think it's not the right answer. As long as this guy's a madman and he's leading people, we have to pay attention to what he's saying.
Well, we don't know, say, January 21st, like whether or not some of this fervor for him will die down. And it's a touch of a chicken egg situation because it won't die down if we still cover him minute by minute. And like, let's also be clear. The president has been very vocal about the fact that, MSNBC, CNN, all of the networks, ABC, CBS, you say one thing, but like, let's be clear. I'm the reason why all of you guys are doing well in the ratings. And most of the heads of these corporations are Trump supporters. They love the president in some capacity because he's putting money in their coffers in ways that they've never seen. And Donald Trump has said that about them constantly. So like, I think he's been like this horrible opioid. Like he is this drug, this cancer that's in our country that has excavated all of this other bile in our country. It's going to take a while to sort of shift the focus away from him, because Joe Biden isn't going to be exciting. You know why? Because he's working. He's reading. He's actually meeting with people. He's not watching TV all day and tweeting like he's, a stoner 16-year-old. Like he'll actually be trying to undo what has been done and figure out and problem solve, right? Well, meet with people who are scientists, meet with people who are doctors, meet with people who are urban planners, meet with people who know the international communities, meet with our allies who haven't had a legitimate conversation in 4 years, meet with our adversaries who were just like, well, I thought we were best friends. And, here's what the president said that we were going to do. So, he's got a lot of work on his plate. So he's not going to be sort of, we're not going to wake up every morning to 7 a.m. and Joe Biden's like, I hate this here. Why doesn't anyone like me? No, we're not going to have that because he's part of the no drama Obama clique. Like, it's just like, put your head down and get your work done.
Yeah.
The fact that Joe Biden's been a public servant for almost 50 years and there's no like major scandal, like he's not exciting like Trump. Like Trump would give us like 5 scandals a day.
more often, and just if it wasn't classified as a scandal, it was just a comment that you'd have to look at it a few times. Like he didn't say that he there's no way that he would. I mean, he did.
Think of it this way, Pete. The very first thing he did when he got sworn in, like the next 2 weeks, the Muslim ban, which he said he was going to do. So, don't pretend he wasn't honest. And so, like, going back to your original question about like the collective trauma, do you know how stressful that's been for immigrant families, especially immigrant families?
I certainly don't, but I've tried to discuss it with them here on the podcast and off the air because I think it's important to understand the trauma, by the way, that anybody is going through that is, consistently dealing with it. And in this case, I just can't imagine living in the shadows. I mean, the idea of having to worry, we're all so stressed and anxious about not getting this virus and about losing our jobs and our money. But imagine those two plus, if I go outside, if I go to work, I could get arrested and thrown out of the country. No, I can't imagine what they're dealing with is my answer.
So it's like, hey, don't get coronavirus because you don't want to go to a hospital and possibly end up in ICE detention. Right.
Yeah.
Or, I hope that you don't have any hate crime that happens to you because you can't go to the hospital. Or I hope you're not in a domestic violence situation. You can't go to the hospital. I mean, like the compounding fear that so many families and communities, right? Because it's not just an individual. It's an individual who belongs to a family, who belongs to a community. And that's just the level of stress I can't imagine. And we know that stress over money leads to all types of negative health effects and behavioral effects.
Yeah.
I mean, like the spike in crime is like, right, because people are worried about money and their health. Like, I don't leave the house nowadays when it gets dark. I just don't. There's no point. Like, why do I need to be on the street when people are broke and feeling desperate? And I have an iPhone, which is $200-$300 on the open market. And I'd be going to the bodega. So it's like I have a credit card and some cash on me. Like, why would I even need to tempt fate? Like, let me be one less person on the street.
It's all very interesting and very true and very challenging right now for a lot of people. And we're going to have, another 6 months, no matter what, at least. Probably, I mean, it depends on whose analysis you look at, but I think that's pretty conservative.
I told myself 2022 is basically when we're sort of like, back.
Oh, you're giving it a lot more time. I read this great post and my friend.
Fall 2022 is my thought.
This is it's called The Halfway Point. My friend Barry Ritholtz wrote at his blog, The Big Picture, which is like using the data available. We might be right now at the halfway point with the pandemic, but hard to predict, hard to know, and so it's not necessarily accurate. But the idea of having that perspective and knowing where we're at, I think, is a really healthy thing to do. And you're a person who I've gotten to know really well, and I know that you have some really great techniques and secrets to take care of your own mental health. So anytime you want to share those with me or anybody, very appreciated. Let me ask you,
right now, sadly, I'm into buying sneakers. So like that.
What? That's another post he wrote, actually, about consumerism. We talked about that yesterday. Why do you do that? It makes you feel like you like to shop for them. It makes you, are you a sneakerhead?
Yeah, and they're bright and colorful. I've never been a sneakerhead. I think it's also like, I'm projecting that one day I will be out again walking around.
Oh, wow.
Like, it feels aspirational.
Right.
So, I bought a pencil sharpener because it reminded me of the past and it made me happy. Right. So, like, I'm buying things that all have like a deliberate focus. And so, like, I think the shoes right now represent like me feeling like we will emerge from this. I will be walking around with friends. I will be, enjoying the city the way I used to. And it feels like I'm preparing for an emergence. So this is like the hibernation winter phase. I'm sort of toying with the idea of going to LA, but I don't know about the flight situation. So like I'm sort of figuring out some things. But everything that I buy, like I'm working on this project now about Barbara Jordan and Fannie Lou Hamer and Stacey Abrams. So I have this picture of Fannie Lou Hamer that is like framed and on the wall. I just bought like a big sort of picture off of eBay of Barbara Jordan. So I'll like frame that and like put that on the wall. So it's like, okay, now it's time to write. So like, I'm sort of viewing this as, well, I got to get this book done. So
good.
I'm going to hunker down anyway. Let's just use this as a time to hunker down and write. I've not been writing academic writing since the pandemic. So
well, I'm excited for that project. Will you be typing in your sneakers, do you think?
I tend not to write with shoes on, even when I'm in the library. I also tend to write longhand.
Least important question. Oh, that's really interesting. I'd like to see your what your handwriting looks like. Our least important person.
School.
Very easy question. It's a yes/no question. How do you? Actually, it's not. Where are you on candles?
Oh, I'm like my mother, huge candle person. My dad used to come home and he's like, it's like a goddamn seance in here. Like,
that's funny. That is funny.
Like
all those candle jokes are funny. Yeah.
I have like a serenity candle that I burn during the day.
Okay.
It's like a clarity candle. I have one that just burned out. I have to go to the store and get another one. I keep it by the door. It's like a protection type clear energy candle. So like basically the energy of whoever's walking past my home sort of gets the energy of that candle hopefully emanates out of the door. But then I like scented candles. Like I love a spruce in the wintertime.
Love it.
I love like an ocean breeze. Like a good spruce. West Elm had the best spruce candles. Oh, and it's, it reminds you of Christmas. And my mom was always a big Christmas person. So like the holidays always felt like the holidays. The house just had that like weight to it, where it just feels like there's like pine trees. And she's from the deep South. So she always used to go home and collect pine cones and like bring them back up north.
Love it.
That was always my job, to like grab a few pine cones before we left my grandparents' house. And like, she's very artsy. So like, there's always poinsettias. I just actually got her a poinsettia when I saw her over Thanksgiving. It's like a mini one, but I was like, hey, the holiday season is here. She had like a black Mr. Mrs. Claus before, like you could get black Mr. Mrs. Clauses. And there's like these dolls that like sit on the piano.
Could you not get them when you were little?
It's very difficult. You could get them like once in a blue moon.
Why not? Why wouldn't some smart black entrepreneur at least be selling them?
Well, that's what started happening in the 80s. And now you can get them anywhere and everywhere. But like in the 80s, it was sort of very sort of rare that you could find black Santa Clauses.
How do you feel? What is your answer to someone who is upset when they see a black Santa Claus? Because as we know, Megyn Kelly confirmed this, Santa is white.
Right. Well, Megyn Kelly is the arbiter of nothing. I mean, listen, I think representation matters. Like, I love when you see like, Japanese Santa, Dominican Santa, black Santa. Like, it depends on what's going on in a kid's household. I mean, I do think it's, hilarious when you listen to comedians and they're like, listen, I'm not letting my kids believe in Santa Claus. It's my money, right? So it's like,
any comedy, all comedy about related to Santa is fine, but we're not talking about that. I don't think, when I was growing up, there weren't black Santas. I will say this: when I believed in Santa, it was because my cousins in Chicago, my dad's brother, his wife, and they're all older cousins because my dad's brother's 10 years older than him. They would call us on Christmas Eve, and my uncle would sort of say he was Santa. My aunt would get on the phone as Mrs. Claus. And we were kids, so it's not like I talked to them on the phone ever. And then all of my cousins were in the background, like clanking pots and pans. And they're like, we're making your gifts. And I was like, hurry, Santa, it's Christmas Eve. But like my dad would tell him, what was on our Christmas list. So they're like, and so Chrissy, you want the pink bike with the streamers and your Duran tape. And this is amazing. I love it. Did they change their voice?
People, like Santa called me and I spoke to the elves and like they knew my list and blah, 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 blah.
See, that's where the lie gets dangerous. Right. Oh, that's funny. Oh, that's great. I love that idea.
Yeah.
All right. Let me, I have just a couple minutes more left with you. And I want to ask you what you think about the transition so far. And you've been following, obviously, politics. You're obviously a political scientist, but you know the players here. And I wonder what you think about the appointments so far that Joe Biden has made.
Yeah, I'm fine with them so far. I mean, obviously the Bernie folks are pissed and it's like Joe Biden, they're always going to be pissed. So like, just keep it moving. I'm sorry. Like the Bernie folks are really mad that Bernie's not the nominee. You know why Bernie's not the nominee? Because of Bernie. Okay. Bernie chose not to go to South Carolina. Bernie chose not to go to Selma. Bernie chose not to talk to black people. Bernie chose not to talk to black women. Bernie chose to have black women, but not talk to black women. So guess what? That's why your candidate's not being sworn in as the president-elect. So for Joe Biden to try and chase after Bernie supporters, I think is a failed mission. To try and think about progressives, that's the different conversation. But I think, I was telling some colleagues this the other day, I think we are so far off track. I think he's trying to put in establishment people to get us on track, and then we'll think about a new direction. But right now we need to put the train back on track. I know a lot of folks are like, no, because then we'll never go into like the new progressive direction. It's like, well, first of all, the majority of the country is not progressive. And so they're not interested in that direction. I'm interested in that direction, but I have to recognize that I'm not the majority in that sense. But I do think that we need people who fundamentally understand the job so we can get the agencies back to where they need to be as far as functioning is concerned. And I know there's a really low hanging bar, but like, as long as Rahm Emanuel is nowhere near that White House.
Well, black people don't like Rahm Emanuel because of one specific incident about when he was the mayor of Chicago. I mean, maybe there's a lot of things, but the thing I keep seeing point to is the Laquan McDonald case.
Laquan McDonald, and Rahm. Everybody can look it up. I can't explain it, but the guy was killed by the police. He was shot like 30 times, 17 times.
Unarmed, I think.
Yes,
and there's video of it, and then he covered it up as the mayor, right? Is that, am I getting?
And the video came out way after, and it was like largely because Rahm Emanuel helped cover it up to help his reelection chances. And so he's persona non grata.
Across the board, like you don't see anybody, I mean, doesn't mean there isn't anybody if we don't see anybody, but like that's pretty much, there's no way in for him. Because
I mean, if he wants to see black folks turn on him, like instantly, like right now, the sort of Black Lives Matter crowd, the progressive black people are like, listen, we're not in love with all your choices, but like we're giving you some time, right? And we'll see how this whole thing shakes out. You put Rahm Emanuel in there, it's like that's when I'm going to turn against you immediately, like because that you're telling me you don't get it. And so, like similarly for your listeners who are in New York City. All the candidates right now are talking about
running for mayor.
Oh, if I'm elected, I'll get rid of, Commissioner Shea, who's a colossal failure and a disaster. But it's like, but that's the wrong question. The question is, who are you going to replace him with?
Right. And
that's the question. Because, of course, everyone's going to get rid of him. Because if I had known Bill de Blasio was going to bring in Bratton, that would have changed my vote.
It's really interesting to see what the kind of litmus test or the threshold for, black Democrats, black Americans in general about where the line is for Joe Biden. It seems like just based on the appointments that he's making, he obviously Kamala Harris and many of the other women of color already that we're seeing in place. Looks like he understands that on his, the night of that he basically accepted the win, the fireworks night, the drone night. He, said some really, I think, important things about black folks and how they brought him to the party, basically.
And also he's hiring like qualified black folks. He's not just picking black folks off the street for black folks' sake, which I think is important.
It's almost always the case with Democratic presidents. Like we could disagree on their opinions, but they have all of the credentials and experience in general.
Yeah. Donald Trump has like gone after people who were specifically not qualified.
Scott Atlas. He's a radiologist. He saw on Fox News, and he put him in charge of the coronavirus task force. That's the best example to me.
Or like Ben Carson.
Carson
so you
HUD.
lived in public housing when you were a kid, and so now instead of being the Surgeon General, I'm going to put you in charge of housing. And you're so obnoxious that you actually accepted it. I mean, like, that's the crazy thing. Like, these people are accepting jobs. It's like you are wholly unqualified, yet you're still taking the job.
That's like, really good point. Yes.
Like if someone was like, Chrissy, I think you should be, transportation secretary. It's like, okay, so I've been on the board of a transportation organization. I study urban politics. I, talk and write about transportation somewhat extensively. I know I'm not qualified to be transportation secretary. I'm not qualified to be deputy transportation secretary. Well, I'm not qualified to be under deputy transportation. But so it's like, I know the limitations.
Right. This is about ambition. It's about blind ambition. It's also about, I think, let's be even more honest. It's about destroying the agency that they're in charge of. So it's more likely he's putting people in places. And Republicans have been doing this for a long time, unfortunately, to destroy government.
Yeah. But they love to run up the bill. I mean, I don't know why Democrats just constantly, allow Republicans to perpetuate the narrative that they're the ones who want small government. I'm like, you guys spend money like, you're drunk sailors.
I have an opinion
what is going on?
I have an opinion on that, which is that Democrats don't know how to talk about taxes, which is the price of civilization.
Democrats don't know how to play offense. Democrats don't know how to do a lot of things. Yeah. But keep in mind also, though, A, it's a much bigger tent. B, it's a much more diverse tent.
Right.
And when it comes to Black people, 90%, actually 91% of the ideological diversity of Black people is trapped into one party. So like you have hyper conservative Black people who are Democrats because they don't want to be in the party of white nationalists. So you've got the bluest of the blue Democrats, hardcore lefty, progressives, all the way to your moderate and your moderate conservative Black people and everybody in between. So like the shades of blue in the Democratic Party are vast. They're massive. But when it comes to Black folks, it's like 91% of people are all trapped in the same party together. And it's like, and if the Republicans were smart and got themselves together, they could actually do some real plucking off of older Black people, conservative Black people, Black immigrants would be super low-hanging fruit, but they just won't do it.
They don't like them. They don't like Black people. That's why.
No, they don't.
They like the Black people can help them get someplace, but they don't like Black people enough to do things that would make a lot of Black people support almost anything that they're doing, even buy a fucking pillow. So let me get your reaction just finally to what you think about, I don't know if you heard this or not yet, but President Obama gave an interview to Snapchat's Peter Ham. Yeah, I like Peter. And he basically said that there's a soundbite going around today, not looking at the whole quote, maybe we should, but he's like, listen, you lose people with snappy slogans like defund the police. Was he too flip? Do you think that's accurate? Is it taken out of context? Have you seen this yet?
It's not taken out of context. Listen, Barack Obama is who Barack Obama always was. And I've always told people, I'm like, the only thing radical about Barack Obama is his skin tone. Everything else is a moderate centrist man. Like we saw the way he distanced himself from Jeremiah Wright, quick, fast, in a hurry in that Frederick Douglass type speech, right? Barack Obama has never been a president for Black people. He's a president who happens to be Black. His worldview of Blackness is highly troubling and problematic. And so everyone said, and I agreed with this at the time, he's a Black president. He's got a lot on his plate. Like, we understand white people. Black people understand white people. So it's like we understand the constraints that he's working in. So, we know that he has to behave and say certain things. That was first term Obama. Then it's like, because he's got to get reelected. Then he gets reelected. And it's like, okay, well, he's got to get past, the midterm elections of his second term. After that, lame duck session. Still, same business as usual, same rhetoric. And it's like, oh, let's get it through our little heads that this is the man. Like, this is who he is. So when he makes these statements, it's not, oh, it's flippant. It's like, no, he fundamentally has a worldview of Black people that is antithetical to what a lot of progressive Black people actually think or believe. And also, we can't forget this. We got some daddy issues that he's resolving, and he uses Black people as like the example always. So that's what would enable him to go to Morehouse, the largest graduating class of Morehouse University, all Black male university, and tell them to pull up their pants and like don't become, don't have baby mamas. While Black people sat there in the rain for hours, and you've got grandmothers waiting for the grandsons to walk across the stage, and they get like a finger wagging lecture.
How was that
about
received
being derelict Black people? What'd you say?
How was that received?
I don't know. I mean, it's the president. There are a lot of people who love Obama and what he stands for. But like when you scratch the surface of Obama, he's got some real troubling attitudes towards Black people, Black Americans in particular.
Okay.
And so the snappy slogan of defund the police, is yes, we can is a snappy slogan. Right. And so, there's a way that you can articulate a message and a vision. Sure. And I think Democrats do need to get better at framing certain things. But I think Obama is very dismissive of Black people and Black ideas far too often than I would like to count.
I love asking you questions, talking to you about anything from candles to politics. Thank you for your time. I know you've got to go correct papers and then moderate a panel with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Senator Elizabeth Warren. So I really appreciate you spending some time in the gutter with me. Thank you very much. Dr. Christina Greer, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete.
All right, follow her on Twitter and give her all the support. I love talking to her. She's so great. I'm so glad that we met at MSNBC a couple of years ago now, and I always love when she joins me on the podcast. We talked about quite a bit there. So good. Okay, so moving forward, next guest is one of the most respected policy covering journalists in Washington, D.C., and has been for a really long time. He hosts a really popular podcast on Vox, where he was actually a co-founder, called In the Weeds is the name of the podcast. And he has now just left Vox. and he has started his own newsletter. Slowboring.com is what it's called. He's on Twitter at Matty Yglesias. Matt Yglesias, I should say, at slowboring.com. And his new book is all about why America needs more people. It's called 1 Billion Americans. Here is the host of one of the most popular podcasts out there, The Weeds. Joining me now on Stand Up, Matthew Yglesias and his book, 1 Billion Americans. Now I get to talk directly to the man whose podcast I've been listening, whose work I've been reading. I feel like I interviewed you like a decade ago or something, but it's great to get you on the podcast. Matt, congratulations on the new book, 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's really good to be here.
So there's a billion questions for your book, but I think I want to just kind of start with, in case people aren't familiar with your work, just talking a little bit about how much of a nerd and wonk you are with policy and how much of a fan I am of people like you and why that I think is important. And obviously not enough people pay attention to policy, but why do you think that paying close attention to policy is important for all citizens of a community or a country?
Well, I enjoy it for starters, but I just like doing it. But also, we've got to, I think, really understand what is at stake in sort of, concrete ways, right? I mean, like President Trump is such a dominant force in all of our minds and things. And of course, it's important, that kind of thing. But we can have a healthier society and healthier communities and healthier, frankly, just like mentalities amongst ourselves when we think about what does the government actually do, right? And the government makes policy, and policy impacts people's lives in concrete ways. And that's, always what I've been most interested in covering. It's a little bit difficult in this day and age. But even though this book, the title, 1 Billion Americans, the idea there should be a billion Americans, it's a little fanciful. But if you open it up, right, and you start reading the pages, the idea is to really take you through it. How can we make this work? How can we address these problems? And even if at the end of the day you decide I'm nuts and this idea doesn't make any sense, I hope that you will learn a lot about housing, about transportation, about energy, and the other sort of building blocks of the thesis.
So you have this great podcast that basically deals with policy, The Weeds, right? The Weeds. And
that's what it's called.
And you've always been writing and talking about policy. But my big question for you about it is, why do you think it does not get the kind of ratings that would be necessary to sustain, say, a cable news segment or channel? Because I would imagine, the fact that your reputation and credibility and the outlet that you have behind you, Vox, that your podcast is doing pretty well. And so I think that there are niche audiences for all kinds of things now. But why is there not a more general audience for policy? And is it possible ever to make policy conversations as popular as your friend Tucker Carlson's show?
It's tough, right? I mean, cable is a difficult medium. I think nobody does their best work, I think, on cable news. The people who are cable news hosts, if you read Chris Hayes's books, they're incredible. Yeah. You watch his show, it's by far the best show on cable news show, I think.
I agree with that.
But it's not as good as his books. It's just not a great...
Or his podcast, because it's a longer form.
Exactly. Yeah. It's something about that speed, that pace. You're always shuffling people in and out. I mean, if you've been on television, I don't do a lot of TV, but I've done some, and it's disorienting. You're shuffling in and out around things. You got weird stuff in your ear. There's a picture of the guy you're talking to, and then they're telling you, well, don't look at it. And I find it hard to think, on podcasts like this one, you can have dialogue, right? You can give slightly more expansive answers. You can think things through. I can say something and you can ask,
please rap, Matt. We gotta go to break. I'm so sorry.
Right. And so it's impossible to have a coherent thought up there. Yeah. So you get a lot of I mean, Trump has been so good for ratings, right? It'll be like the president said something crazy, and then they'll bring like 9 little heads in boxes of like, whoa, that's crazy. And then someone else will be like, no, he's in touch with the real people. And it's like the same segment every day.
Yeah, there's a lot of that for sure. But I desperately want people to be paying more attention to policy and always have been, which is why I took the route that I did through, Colbert and The Daily Show and my SiriusXM show and now the podcast, because if you can make it even slightly entertaining and interesting, then you can pick up people that wouldn't necessarily be open to it. And I think that that's always what I've really tried to do with this show. So let me try to do it now with your work and with your book. And I think we already are into it, because it's super important what you write about on a regular basis, what you talk about in your podcast and in your new book, as you mentioned, housing and transportation and energy. Can I start with looking at the countries who have massive populations already? Because you talk about, obviously, China in your book. How did China get to its massive population? And what are the good and obvious? I think more people know about the bad things, the human rights issues in China, than a lot of the good things in bringing people out of poverty. Give us a little history of their population growth.
Sure. So, China has actually been a very densely populated country for a long time. It's I am not a specialist in the history of agriculture, but it's something about growing rice versus growing wheat. Like, you can just support more people in less space with that rice paddy agriculture. And that used to mean actually very low living standards. Right, that Chinese sort of peasant farmers in the 18th century compared to ones in Europe were poorer. They had less diet, less meat and dairy, things like that. And then, China enters the 21st century. There's colonialism. There's Mao, and terrible things are happening there. But since 1980 or so, the Chinese economy has experienced just tons of growth. I mean, per capita growth, which paired with their big population has meant that China has now achieved something like the per capita income of Mexico, which, if you've been to Mexico, it's a nice place, but clearly poorer than the United States, a lot poorer, and not a major power in the world. But you have that Mexico living standards on a per person basis combined with 1.2 billion people. And you've got a great power on the world stage. And that's contemporary People's Republic. Now, we used to hope, right? Bill Clinton in 1999, he announced China's entry into the World Trade Organization. And he said, this is going to be great, right? China's going to want to grow its economy. People will be lifted out of poverty. Those parts happened. And then he said, and they're going to get computers and the internet and this openness to ideas. And it's going to cause liberalization of their political system. And that really didn't happen.
Pump the brakes.
The opposite has happened, right? It's become digital technology has become an engine of surveillance domestically, and their economic clout has been exporting authoritarianism to the United States and Europe. We had, an NBA coach got shut down for tweeting in favor of Hong Kong protesters. We have this great PEN America report on People's Republic censors telling Hollywood movie studios what can be in their movies, not just in the China releases, globally, right? What comes out. This Mulan, just came out and has this weird thank you to the provincial government in Xinjiang, where they're committing some of the worst human rights abuses in the world. So the economic interconnection has been great from a standpoint of global poverty, but from a balance of power and human rights standpoint, it's created some really serious problems.
Yeah, if they weren't so evil and pernicious, it would almost be impressive that they have been able to police a billion, that many people in their country and censor so much from them. You would think that there would be, with that many people, more ideas and more efforts to break the government censorship, but I don't know anything about it either. But
I mean, we thought the top experts in the West were like, well, this will never work.
Right. Yeah,
they're not going to be able to censor all that.
Right.
But it does. They are better at it than our people had thought.
Then what's the difference between, say, a little bit, I know this is not a lot of what you write about in the book, and we'll obviously get to it, but India and Brazil in terms of their massive populations?
So, I mean, India is huge. India has more people than China now, and their population and their population is growing quite a bit faster. But India is still very poor, democratic, which is nice. A lot of issues, though, with their sort of current regime there. I mean, we are not without our own flaws in our government here in the United States. So you don't know where it's going. But, Brazil is still smaller than the United States. So I don't know. I mean, I think we want to hope that India's economy grows strongly in the future, just from a living standards standpoint, right? I mean, rapid economic growth in India would be a wonderful thing for the diminution of poverty. But again, it poses the question of, like, do we want to live in the number 2 or number 3 power in the world? Or do we want to continue to be the sort of, biggest dog on the playground, which we've been for, throughout the entire lives of everybody who's alive today? And that would just be such a huge change, right? And I don't see people saying, okay, we're looking forward to playing second banana to China, and like, here's how we're going to do it. But we're also not saying like, what's the plan here? How are we going to stay on top? And my book argues that we can do it through population growth.
Right. Population growth. And there's 2 ways of getting there. We can have more babies, or we can invite people over to the house, and we'll get to it. But let's take it down, again, a step back and talk a little bit about the problems where you start the book. You talk about chapter 2 is America is empty. And while I'm preparing to interview you, I actually was doing a speaking engagement in way upstate New York, south of Buffalo, New York, in a town called Jamestown. And the natural beauty of upstate New York, where I grew up, is I'm biased, but it's pretty amazing. And it used to be that cities all the way across New York State and even Pennsylvania and Ohio were bustling centers of industry and wealth and jobs. And now it's just depressing as hell. And they try in many different ways to come back. But a beautiful place like Jamestown, a lot of buildings boarded up. And you could say the same all the way across New York State. But my point is, hey, there's a lot of empty, beautiful space. But what could you ever do to fill those towns in terms of a job engine, an industry that would make a difference? I know you addressed that in the book, but how do you describe what happened to those towns, which is, I guess, a whole nother book, and how do you fill them back up with people with good jobs?
Well, so here's the thing. Upstate New York is a great example and has really shaped my thinking about this.
Oh, really?
Okay. Yeah, because so some places, right, like Detroit used to be a really big city, and it has shrunk a lot.
Right.
But what you have in upstate New York, right, is you have Rochester, and you have Syracuse, and you have Utica, and you have Rome, and you have Buffalo. Now, none of those were
Why do you hate Albany?
Oh, well, none of those were ever super enormous cities, right? But they were thriving, prosperous cities, and they have all shrunk. And they are all shrinking. So you can go to one of those cities. I write a lot about urban issues and have for years. So you go to one of those cities and you can talk to people in Rochester and say, okay, here's what we're going to do with Rochester, right? Like, you've got this university, you have a legacy based on Kodak. If we get like one more company in here, we're going to turn this around. But there's so many cities like that, right? You can name a half dozen or more just in New York. Then you go to Pennsylvania and there's Erie. And there's York, and there's Lancaster, right? You go to Massachusetts, there's Springfield, there's Worcester. And that's not even to say anything about the big Midwestern cities. The basic fact is, it's like there are not enough people to go around, right? Unless Americans just totally stop moving to places like Nashville and Austin, there's not going to be people for the smaller, colder cities of the Northeast or the bigger cities of the Midwest. So to revitalize not one city, but all of them, we need to think about having more people in total, having a faster growing population so that all the boats, can actually rise. Then we can talk about the specifics, right? And I think a really powerful lever for those cities is immigration. We see a number of examples like Lewiston, Maine, of there's a city, it was a paper mill town, and some of the mills closed because, I don't know if people have heard, but we do a lot of stuff on the internet now and don't print as much. So, it's nobody's fault, right? Like, we don't print as much. So the paper mill closed. But it's sad, all these places. But in Lewiston, there's a community of Somali refugees. And they came in and they needed a place to live. And because they are present there, it helps stabilize the tax base. They are extra customers for the businesses there. Then they also launch businesses of their own, right? There are restaurants in Lewiston that you can't find elsewhere in Maine. So it brings people in from other places. Some people don't like it, right? Maine is a very non-diverse state.
Right.
And so some people they move to other towns, but other people they think it's interesting and you create more diversity, things like that. We could have programs that the U.S. Conference of Mayors has called for this idea, which I support in the book, which is to say, let cities that want to sponsor extra immigrants go do that so that you could have a situation where instead of our medical records being outsourced by Accenture to somewhere in Bangalore, right, they could build the office in Binghamton and they could bring people there because they want to. They try to apply for these H-1B visas, but we could create sort of city-specific visas. Not every city would want them, but many, I think, would. I mean, many of the mayors in the conference came behind this. A couple of the Democratic presidential candidates endorsed it. It's lurking somewhere in a footnote in Joe Biden's plan. He's never talked about it. But this could be a tremendous sort of engine of revitalization for cities that are not really doing anything wrong. They are just suffering from the general lack of people.
Would you invite people from the shithole countries? And obviously that's a horrific thing to say, but there is
only Norwegians. It's going to be
these Norwegians. But I mean, I think there is a serious conversation about job skills and a kind of a meritocracy. I don't know that I subscribe to that conversation, and I don't really understand it. I'm more of a Statue of Liberty guy. Send us your huddle masses. But how would you look at immigration policy in this case in terms of, how would it change in terms of where they came from, what their education levels were, health concerns, et cetera?
So I think for this sort of urban revitalization program, you should be looking at more skilled immigrants, right? At immigrants with high levels of education, because essentially what we're trying to do here is rebuild the economies of places that have fallen on sort of hard times. So if you can bring in people who, are engineers, things like that, right? That drives corporate investment into those places. Now, my problem with the way Republicans conduct this conversation is they say, oh, yeah, we should have more smart people, more people with high job skills. And I say, great. And they say, well, then to make room for them, we got to take all these visas away from other people. But we don't have to do that, right? There's a visa cap that Congress set, and they could just make it higher. If you go to the big immigrant entry cities, right, where the immigrants we have, they tend to come to coastal cities that are not hurting for jobs, right? There's high wage employment in California and New York, things like that. And they're doing service sector work. They expand the economy. They, you can get tacos and, other stuff like that. And there's no problem with the immigrants we have. What we should do is go get some more immigrants, right? And I do think we should look to more skilled people, take that into consideration, at least when we come in and do it. But there's no need to be dogmatic about it. And there's no need to feel ourselves limited by the current quantities.
Well, what comes first, the jobs or the people in terms of the skilled labor? I mean, would you need an industry in Buffalo? Can you put the horse before the cart? What a terrible metaphor to talk about human beings coming to America for opportunity. I mean, wouldn't you need, if you bring an influx of immigrants into a small town or medium-sized city, do you hope that they're innovative entrepreneurs and come up with restaurant ideas and other ideas, or is there a Tesla factory in town?
Well, so we have a program right now that lets American companies say, I want to bring in X number of computer programmers, right? And you have to apply to a lottery. And we get 4 applications for every visa that we actually hand out. Right. So we know if we said, OK, Microsoft, you didn't win the lottery. You don't get those people. But, Buffalo won its lottery and they brought a bunch of computer programmers over. Well, Microsoft is looking to hire more foreign-born computer programmers. So they opened the office in Buffalo. And then you have people there. They have jobs, but they're not tied to the employer the way H-1B workers are. If they talk to their friends and they say, hey, I got an idea for a new startup they can quit their job. They can go do a startup, things like that, right? So you start seeding more communities with both groups of people who have technical skills and with employers who are oriented around that. And it winds up helping not just the immigrants, but the communities themselves. Because right now, if you grow up in you grow up in Syracuse and then you go to the university there and you're really smart, you're really sharp. You like Syracuse. You grew up there, you got family there, you got friends there, but you want to get a job that puts your skills to use. And there just aren't a lot of employers like that in the Syracuse area. But if they were established to take advantage of an immigrant inflow, things like that, it becomes an opportunity for native born people who have, they like the lakes, right? It's very pretty up there. Yeah. They might have family attachments. They might just like the fact that it's cheap, right? Like what do you pay for a house in Palo Alto versus what you could get in upstate New York?
Well, forget that. My parents' house in Syracuse, the kind of the not even the suburbs, a little bit more rural outside Syracuse, versus my house just north of New York City. It's very hard to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I went to visit my friend in Cazenovia.
Oh, nice. A great town on the lake.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's beautiful. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
And I'm here in Washington, and I've got like a view of an alley.
Oh, I just assumed Matt Yglesias had a mansion in Virginia.
Sure.
That makes me feel better about my raised ranch. So... But we're talking about the part of your book, but I think More and Better Immigrants and the solution, and it's super fascinating for all kinds of reasons. What else have we not covered about that section about immigrants that you would?
I think that's good. You can. There's some nerdy stuff in there, but the other part of this is babies.
Yeah. Let's talk about babies. So I read it. Did you read? I don't know if you read reviews of your book, but Felix Salmon, are you friends with him? He has.
I used to be, but now.
Did you read his review?
Now we're enemies.
He has a critical review of your book, and I think it's one thing that really I had to agree with until I talked to you and you disabused me of it. Is he talks about? I mean, you basically make a case that I think everybody can understand and relate to, which isn't controversial. Is that people think about having kids, and I'm going to really shorten it. When they think about having kids, they say, "Well, I can't afford them." One thing they say is I can't afford them, at least in terms of the lifestyle that I'd like to have. So you talk about policies that so many other countries have that help people afford having and raising their children. But as he points out, those policies haven't necessarily led to higher birth rates in Western Europe. Now, maybe he's wrong, but what's the issue where they have these policies that you recommend that encourage people in having kids? My wife's family lives in Italy, but they're starving for pregnancies over there.
Well, I mean, look, this is not really a sophisticated way of looking at policy, right? If you look cross nationally or domestically, the biggest driver of how many children people in developed countries have is religiosity. Right. So more religious people have more kids. Countries like the United States with higher levels of church attendance have more kids than Europe, where people don't go. But so you want to look at policy as an independent variable, right? So France has the most generous family support policies in Europe, and they have the largest families there. Sweden is number 2, the second largest number of kids there. So people look at this, I'm not a econometrician, but people do the fancy math. And it looks like if we had a generous child allowance policy, right, which is to say, like, we give $600 a month to every parent of young children, and you get $600 for every kid. So it's a lot of money. That would probably generate, about 0.2 extra children per family over the long term. Then, you do preschool, you do a few other things. I think you could get 0.4. Maybe 0.5. So it's not like a huge change, right? Like by the eyeball, right now, most families have either 1 or 2 kids. If we made all the changes I'm talking about, most families would have either 2 or 3 kids. So it wouldn't be like, okay, night and day, but these things compound over the long term. Right, because the way it goes right now, we have slightly below replacement rate births, and then we make up for it with immigrants. If we make these changes, we'll be on a growth trajectory even without the immigrants, and then we'll be adding immigrants, and they have children themselves, and it's off to the races.
Would you indulge me in explaining replacement rate?
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Because when people hear that word now, Matt, they automatically hear the blanks will not replace us.
Yes.
When in fact, your book argues that we need replacement.
Well, we're not so it takes two people.
And why do you have a torch? Why are you holding a torch while you talk about this?
Look, so it takes two people to make a baby, is, how it works. So if you have two kids, then the children replace the parents. Then we say, usually demographers say, well, you really need about 2.1 kids to replace the parents because tragically some people die young. So the great replacement, this is this like far right conspiracy.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, the liberals, they're bringing immigrants over to compensate for the lack of children of, white people. And they're going to wipe out our culture. So I say, let's do both. Let's support people in having children. So nobody is replacing anybody. But let's also let people come here. That's how America has always been, right? The original settlers of the United States were from the British Isles, overwhelmingly Protestant, and they never went away. Like nobody ever replaced those old stock Scots-Irish people. My wife is like one of them. Her ancestors came over in the 18th century, blah, 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 blah. My ancestors, Jewish from Eastern Europe, Cubans via Florida. We didn't replace anybody. We just came and we added to the country. And that's what immigrants from Mexico, immigrants from China have been doing. And that's what we should be doing in the future, supporting people in having as many children as they want so we can all feel happy. And then also letting people come here, which is like the great strength of America over the years, is that a lot of people want to come here.
You grew up in New York. Is that right? New York City?
I did.
And
yes.
My wife and I lived in New York City for 12 years. And after our daughter was about 2.5, she got pregnant with her second daughter. And we didn't even really, it was harder for me than for her to come to the decision. But we didn't really argue about it. We had to leave because we couldn't afford to stay with the kind of lifestyle that we wanted. And by that, I mean, two bedrooms. But and not having to push our kid around in a stroller everywhere. That's neither here nor there. But the issue, of course, was schools. And I mean public schools. I don't mean that we couldn't afford a private school. That was never really an option or what I want it to be. I worked at private schools in New York City and I didn't want that for my kids. But the public schools were competitive. And so, how do you live in a city like New York and think, yeah, I'll have kids and they'll get a good education here, because that's one of the biggest issues that you identify and you have and you work for a long time. But how do you live in a city and have a decent life? Like, what would be the policy to encourage parents like we were to have kids and stay?
Look, you got to make it possible to build more housing in places like New York, right? Like, we know, technologically speaking, how to build spacious apartment buildings that middle class people can afford to rent. And it's just not allowed in places like New York. And in a weird way, the conversation gets very focused on affordable housing for the poor, which is obviously an important topic. And I don't want to denigrate it, but it is also a real issue that, people like you and your wife, or people like me. So I grew up in Manhattan. My parents bought a place in the Village in 1980. And at that point in time, it was not that expensive a place to live because New York had a poor reputation coming out of the 1970s. And it is inconceivable that I could afford the apartment that I grew up in. And that's not because I'm a poor person. Like, I've got a good job.
Got that Vox cast. You're Matt Yglesias. Come on.
I consider myself a relatively privileged person. Like, the government should not be giving me extra money to get an apartment. But it shouldn't be impossible for me to afford an apartment in the neighborhood I grew up in. And that's because we have clamped down on construction in the desirable neighborhoods, right? So we fight about gentrification. Like my friends who live in the city, writer friends, they all live in like Bed-Stuy or Flatbush. Right. And there's questions about displacement there, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Meanwhile, you go to the Upper West Side, right? You go to these.
That's where we lived.
Yeah. So Brownstones by Columbus Avenue, they've got extra subway capacity on the BC train. But like, you can't replace them with bigger buildings because the rich people have too much political clout and they exclude people.
Well, it's simple economics, isn't it? In terms of if you build a tall building, you want there to be smaller units to fit more people in to get more rents as opposed to larger units without the equivalent rent. I don't know what the economics are, but it would seem that it's more about cramming more tenants in to smaller spaces. Well,
that's the thing. If you limit it, right? So in DC, our rules are simpler than in New York, so it's easier to describe.
And by the way, liberals are at fault here.
Yeah. So look, if you say
not more than conservatives, but equally,
if you say the building can only be 6 stories tall, well, then the way to make the most money is to make really little studios and get as many people as possible in. Now, if you say, look, you can build it however tall you want, well, the first guy's going to say, OK, I'm going to build 6 stories and I'm going to make studios. But then somebody else, like, it's competition. It's like anything else. Somebody says, maybe I'll make bigger units. Maybe I'll get some extra customers that way. But we don't, have that in our cities. Now, we have some legislation, right? So Cory Booker has a bill to sort of make it easier to build apartments in expensive places. And this is built around, honestly, an analysis that the Trump administration's Council of Economic Advisors did. But Trump got wind of it. And, he doesn't care about policy. And he's got a real nose for racial conflict. So now he's been running around the country saying, well, if Joe Biden becomes president, Cory Booker is going to put scary low-income housing near you and terrify your suburban housewives. And that's, it's horrible, but I think it has opened the eyes of some people to what's really going on in the land use in the United States.
The most hilarious response to that was the kind of, Cory, like from the suburban housewives, Cory Booker is going to be in the neighborhood? Tell him to come over.
Cory Booker's a really nice guy.
He's the greatest. I've interviewed him, met him.
Trying to make him out to be like an alarming figure. It's well, it's pretty racist.
Yeah,
I don't know what else to say about it.
Super racist. But the other issue that you identify here about, and you write about it, I'm really fascinated about this, and you're a housing nerd, which I love. There's not many out there that write about it, but I think it's super important and interesting, and everybody needs a space to live, so everybody should be at least a little bit interested in this. Is, of course, the big question about your book, A Billion Americans, is climate change, energy, sustainability, consumption. And if we stay with housing, all of the supplies needed to make a large building are very bad for the environment, specifically concrete and steel, which you can speak about at length. So how do you do it? You can't do it with the current materials, can you, Matt?
So, one thing is that we've actually had important breakthroughs in mass timber as a construction material. You can safely build buildings up to 18 stories tall out of wood. And so instead of using high carbon creation of steel and concrete, you can actually sequester carbon dioxide in the wood. But building codes generally don't allow it. There was a great report came out recently by the Roosevelt Institute. A guy named J.W. Mason did it. And they're looking at World War II and the sort of mobilization there for military equipment. And what he shows is that, contrary to what you might think, civilian consumption actually went up during the war. Right. Civilian living standards rose even as they were making all this other stuff. And his argument, which I buy, is that if you think about a real national mobilization to address our climate and energy needs, you get there by producing more, not by consuming less. Right, that we need huge investments in the creation of clean energy, in different kinds of transportation systems, different kinds of home heating systems, things like that. But it's about saying yes, funding, regulating so that we can add sustainable things that we need, not trying to shrink down, because you're never going to sort of austerity your way to sustainability, because, you can even live in a shack in Vermont and, compost and stuff like that. But you still got to heat your cabin.
Enough about my dream.
It's some people's dreams. But, I think that ecologically minded people have to be out of an austerity mindset and into an abundance mindset. It's like, how do we create huge amounts of zero carbon electricity?
It's a really fascinating and important issue. The new book is 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger. And of course, he's the co-founder of Vox, the host of the great podcast, The Weeds. He's awesome on Twitter. Matt, thank you very much for joining me. Congratulations on the book. Keep up the great work. I'm always following, listening, reading, and it's great to be able to lob a few questions at you. Thanks, pal.
Thank you so much.
All right, check him out on Twitter and his podcast, and of course, Slow Boring. Slowboring.com is his new venture, Matt Yglesias. Thank you to Dr. Christina Greer. Thank you for your support. If you haven't signed up for a paid subscription for this podcast yet, what are you waiting for? The podcast is free, but it's not cheap. I put hours and hours into it every day. I book the podcast, I host the podcast, I edit the podcast every night, and I would appreciate it if you would sign up for a paid subscription, because that will help me keep doing this show, and you'd be a welcome part to our community, which will be hanging out tonight at 8 p.m. East. If you're a paid subscriber, you can join us for that hangout. We're going to talk about COVID, fatigue, and more. And also, you'll have access to the Discord platform, which is always going. There's always somebody to talk to at the Discord platform, which helps us all get through sometimes the day. You're never alone if you're a member of the stand-up community. All right, I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.